Thank you everyone for coming. I'll share my screen real quick. That should be appearing for everyone if I did that right. So my presentation, Ted invited me to talk today
Hold
about.
on. Oh, it's still loading. Okay, now we see it. Now we see it.
Okay.
Great.
He invited me to talk about my experience in the spring of 2023 at the University of Connecticut as an undergrad, incorporating sociocracy into the classroom. We had a student group called Students for Environmental Justice. And in that group, we had a grant. And so we hired Ted as a trainer because we were trying to do something different, which I'll elaborate on as we get into it. So for context, we applied for the undergraduate environmental grant at the University of Connecticut. We were a group of 9 students and 1 professor, myself included. I was the principal investigator, so I was the one they awarded the grant money to and was supposedly leading the group. That said, from the start, we had it pretty clear in our heads that we wanted the classroom to shed its hierarchical model. So I wasn't leader as much as facilitator. Um, Officially, our student group was an independent study with Dr. Phoebe Godfrey. That's what it was sort of formally contextualized as. But like I mentioned, we wanted to shed the institutional hierarchical model of the classroom and sort of engender a space that nurtures transformative education or transformative experiences, with those two concepts, education and experiences, being understood as pretty inextricable. Um, and a space that centers students' intrinsic curiosities and passions. That was a big one, was the nurturing of intrinsic motivation, because within the current more formal educational structure, um, it's very much centered around estrangement. It's very much coercive. It's not concerned with the intrinsic motivations of students as much as it might put on a facade of being otherwise. And we wanted to engender a space that was governed by the students. Um, so they're empowered to pursue their intrinsic motivations, their intrinsic curiosities. So the way that we sort of went about pursuing these myriad goals was through a variety of what I've called here radical framings. So sociocracy was one concept we brought in, and it was the principal structure of our decision-making process as a group. And holding change was sort of an investigation into facilitation and into organization. Grief and emotionality, we explored those dimensions together about how organizing often pays no heed to the emotional dimension of both individuals and sort of the communal dynamics of emotion that arise in organization, and grief as well, because organizations don't exist in vacuum. We are all very embedded within a system that continues to induce trauma and violence, and so we are in need of processes of grief. And this is a context that arises in organizational settings and endeavors. Intersectionality, so how do our identities play a role in emergent hierarchies within the organization? Anti-capitalist mindfulness, so mindfulness as a means of desocializing ourselves from the do sort of mentality of capitalism. Nonviolent communication, which very much ties into sociocracy. And I'm sure you've noticed all of these tie into each other. But nonviolent communication as a means of sort of shedding the domination-oriented predisposition we have to communication. Systems theory, Um, and this specific book, Leadership and the New Science, which explores the ways that organizations should have an approach of biomimicry and or biomimicry, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, and adopt a means of communication that are very transparent, so free flowing communication, not so much the restrictive top down, very scarce communication that's traditionally used. And the student to teacher journey was another central sort of theme of our group. The idea that all students are on this transformative journey of becoming teachers, like reflective of that refrain of if you want to be sure you've learned something, explain it to a layman, or if you see the Buddha in the road, kill him, because it's sort of your becoming of the Buddha, this um, willingness to embody what you have learned. So, what was Sociocracy for in our student group? Our student group was called Students for Environmental Justice, and so we had a very specific orientation. And that said, we were very aware of the context that educational institutions are a coercive microcosm of the capitalist structures they emerge from. So they're conducive to a strange studying in a hierarchical classroom. So sociocracy was a means of nurturing intrinsic motivation in the classroom, as I mentioned before, a means of re-imbuing education with dimensions of radical transformation, self-discovery, and critical thought, all of these which are sort of fruits of the nurturing of intrinsic motivation. So via the intrinsic motivation that is nurtured by sociocracy, the empowerment that is given by sociocracy in the classroom, you are allowed avenues to radical transformation, to student self-discovery, and to critical thought. Sociocracy was also an end. The idea is that this is how classrooms should be. The classroom as a practice of collaborative organization, and the classroom as a conduit for the re-embodiment of grassroots energies, a continuous practice and performance of empowerment. So this idea that the classroom is sort of a microcosm for um, reclaiming the bottom up energies, which we are very much disconnected from, those of us, I guess, embedded within the globalized heteropatriarchal capitalist modernity, um, or sort of the grassroots energies that have been atrophied within us. Um, and this little graphic on the left is, yeah, we didn't go to school today and we're not going to go tomorrow. Sort of this um, pretty direct uh, rebuking of the current school as we know it. Not to say that education is the issue, but it's more to assert that the school that is institutional and traditional and or I guess traditional within the globalized capitalist system and which we are most familiar with may not even be comparable to the sort of classroom that is engendered by sociocracy, the sort of classroom we're trying to strive for. So how did we incorporate sociocracy? It was incorporated into our weekly meetings after we received some brief trainings, two brief trainings from TED, because we were able to hire a trainer thanks to the grant money we acquired. And so we incorporated rounds, which was basically that all of our weekly meetings, um, just to sort of paint a picture for you, there was no teacher and student. It was all the students and the quote unquote professor came together once a week and we talked about what do we want to do with this class? What do we want the curriculum to be? What do we want to do with the grant money we have? Um, and the idea was to be equitable from the start. So We incorporated rounds. That's how we made our decisions. That's how we discussed. Consent, the other dimension of decision making, and circles. We eventually incorporated towards the latter half of the semester, when we had sort of smaller groups doing their own individual projects. Um, so while we weren't we didn't do a whole semester long in-depth dive into what sociocracy is, um, we attempted to the best of our ability, embody the structures of sociocracy that we were taught, and sort of move adaptively through these structures over the course of the semester. We were in conversation with other dimensions like the ones I mentioned. For example, we had grounding meditations at the start of every meeting for 15 minutes for the sake of addressing sort of the emotional dimension of organizing, for the sake of nonviolent communication, making ourselves more conducive to, um, I don't want to say productive, but I guess collaboration. Um, and we had intentional foundational conversations about our identities, about race, gender, disability, economic status, sort of these unsaid things that are our context that do factor into the ways that we organize, and about grief to the extent that we felt comfortable speaking about it, about the ways that grief has factored into our lives as students in the academy, and the ways that it's sort of just pervasive in life. And so being intentional about addressing that within this space of our lives, this organization. Our configuration of sociocracy was unique in that it was one semester long, so it was only from January to May. So it was a pop-up basically, and it was fluid throughout, I guess, was the result of that. It was dynamic throughout because there was never sort of a point of rest or of settling in. From the start, we knew that we were going to end. So um, it was sort of a coming into sociocracy, a learning and adapting, and then a intentional closing of our group. It was a relatively small group, so 10 members total, um, which, from what Ted told us at the time, was unusual for a sociocratic group. It was pretty small, but we were intentional with it regardless. And shifting teacher student dynamics, because um, we, I, the facilitator, and the professor, would often bring in materials that we would offer to the class, and that they would have a choice in whether or not they wanted to engage with. So there was that teacher student dynamic there. And so, how did that play into the fact that all of our decision making, the fact that our group itself was decentralized, it was sociocratic? There was also a special challenge, which I'm going to describe, that we ran into. And I once heard Ted describe it. I'm sure it was during those first trainings as well. And I paraphrase it here because I have no idea what the exact words were from 2 years ago. Sometimes overzealous business executives will bring this radical new idea for governance to their company. And so the employees are thrust from a hierarchical to a sociocratic model, often without any input. So who decides that now we're doing sociocracy? Now we're implementing sociocracy. That's very much what happened in our case. The young people, the students, I put quote unquote students because that's the identity that they had assumed over the course of 15 years of being in a context of the hierarchical classroom. They were handed back the reins. And it's a challenge that Phoebe, the aforementioned professor, shared across a variety of her own sociological classrooms, because those sociology courses that she held were similarly radical. They were very much intent upon nurturing intrinsic motivation, giving power back to the students. And so she would often see students sort of be handed this power and be like, what do I do with this? Like, tell me what to do. I don't want to have to um, come up with something myself. I would like to be told what to do, please. Um, our students, the students for environmental justice, I say our students, but I was one of the students. We didn't oppose this shift. They didn't oppose the shift. There wasn't sort of a sentiment of, um, I'd rather this be hierarchical. There was an eagerness. And so there was sort of an ease in adopting sociocracy in that sense. We overcame the challenge pretty quickly. Um, and Phoebe and I served as the doula for sort of transitioning into sociocracy for a group that was already willing. So that's sort of a context. Maybe in other classrooms, it wouldn't be so easy. Um, all that to say, this is somewhat, well, very much anecdotal. This is not so much a conceptual exploration of general tenets of sociocracy in the academy and the classroom, but instead, what was our specific experience? So, real quick, I'll go over what we did. Um, the radical grassroots empowerment wasn't only our bones, it wasn't only the structure of the group, but it's what the group was explicitly oriented towards. It was both the subject of our studies and the mission that guided our activism. Because that was another dimension of our group. We weren't only studying, we were very much intending to use our opportunity to organize sociocratically, the students we had willing to give their time and energy, and the grant money that we had to enact activism on UConn campus at the University of Connecticut. So the three areas that centered us were nonviolent activism, mindfulness as a form of liberation and resilience, and sociocracy. These were sort of the, I guess, three subjects that we had in mind throughout the semester. And of course, all the other radical framings that I already mentioned were also subjects of study. So here's a couple images and pictures of presentations we gave. That's me with my big hair 2 years ago. We formed circles because the classroom that we were presenting to wasn't so much a formal sociocratic setting that we gave them. It was more that over the course of the semester, in intentionally engaging in sociocracy, we, as members of the group, sort of intuitively brought these non-hierarchical collaborative constructs and settings to the classrooms that we attended. We just were prone to bring circularity to it, sort of as I guess, like a downward saturation. And here's just some images of our mindfulness, our anti-capitalist mindfulness presentation, talking about specifically mindfulness in the academy. Like, have you ever felt like you spend much of your day dreading what you'll have to do next? You feel more or less worthy or of value depending on how productive you've been. These are questions we ask because these are experiences that we experienced and that we knew were um, sort of incredibly pervasive across students, not only at UConn, but at most formal institutions. And so we introduced mindfulness as sort of a means of desocializing from that. Here's some other activities we had. We had embodiment walks with the intention of de-estrangement or reconnection with our own bodies, with other bodies, with the land, with the earth, and this intuitive, experiential coming to know that we are continuous with the land, we are continuous with the earth. Um, step by step, little by little, small is all was another guiding tenet that none of this had to be tearing down the system. It had to be more tending for others and growing the flowers we can and understanding that every impact we make is resonant and fractal. We had B-bomb workshops, which were these little pop-up workshops, these art workshops that we invited students just walking by to join us and make bee bombs out of clay, soil, and pollinator seeds, just these little balls. And it was for the same purpose of sort of resting your mind, mindfulness, taking a break from the treadmill of the capitalist educational institution, also bringing awareness to pollinators, sort of that specific dimension of our ecological crises, and maybe a small dimension of grassroots energies, guerrilla seeding. Once you have these little clay balls of pollinator seeds, you're encouraged to slingshot them somewhere or throw them into some yard somewhere on campus or wherever. And through that, you would be thickening pollinator pathways. And then play as resilience. There was this emphasis on play, puzzles, Legos, playing with the soil. It's usually understood as a childish way of being within the context of, within a context where maturity is equal to productivity. So instead, we intentionally sort of push the reclamation of free, slow, light-hearted appreciation of the miracle of life and the miracle of days, just sort of this relaxation and willingness to play, to enjoy, and to do so slowly. And so we just held like a mini festival during finals week for passing students to join. The strategy was that's the week that students are most pressed and tense and fearful, and so giving them sort of a space for respite. That's we held little picnics and brought Legos and toys and puzzles, and I had photos, but I couldn't find them, unfortunately. It was a wonderful time though. And then we held some trainings not only for our group, but open to any students who wanted to join us from campus. Trainings around nonviolent activism, so not just sort of describing nonviolent activism as like a moral high ground, but instead exploring the particular benefits that nonviolent activism provides activists strategically. And it was also a grounded training in, if you want to organize, here's how you do it. Sociocracy, um, already sort of delved into that. And then mindfulness, it's just sort of some, well, it was mindfulness. I think it's kind of self-explanatory. Sociocracy throughout our semester served as both classroom and subject. So it was an interweaving of the classroom, the means and structure of radical education beyond the bounds of the modern academy, and the subject of our studies, learned in an interiorizing and transformative way, thanks in part to the structure provided by having sociocracy in the classroom. So there was sort of that continuous give and take, the blurring of boundaries between what you're learning and where you're learning it, between context and subject. Um, and that was sort of reflective of the fractal patterns that I understand to be fundamental to sociocracy. Intentional ways of being pervasive and saturating across levels. Also, this isn't really a separate point, but this interweaving was a way of nurturing the participatory and experiential dimension of education. Another intention behind our incorporation of sociocracy into our classroom was addressing the way that the modern academy atrophies intrinsic motivation. Sort of touched on this already, but it is in capitalism's interests, with the modern academy understood as a microcosm of the capitalist context from which it emerged. So it's in capitalism's interests to subject children's revolutionary novelty and their revolutionary energies to 8 hours a day and 15 years of domestication, swallowing material they have little choice in, learning to behave in hierarchical contexts and to compete for the approval of authority figures, and spending their sacred energies on conceptualization, the vast majority of which will be unused and forgotten. So the Sociocratic classroom was a means of returning power as an exercise in initiative, sort of working out that muscle again, which has been atrophied, the muscle of spontaneous activism. And this activism isn't just sort of the commonly understood strumming the strings of eco-social change in one's community, but also as being active. So in that way, the modern academy inculcates passivity, inculcates sort of this deadened obedience. So sociocracy as a means of activism, activism understood as autonomy and power, which the sociocratic classroom may grant. So here's a quote that I found from 2 years ago in one of our final reflections. Um, in my Wednesday meditations, I touch on something like this: that you can swim in any lake, climb any tree, flip all the furniture in this room, that we so often forget the true visceral extent of our free will. You can just do activist activities like renting a table and going into the green and holding a seed bomb event. We didn't need this group to do that. And any one of us can do anything of the sort whenever we please. So the Sociocratic classroom over this semester was meant as a conduit for students to be able to practice and re-experience being active, essentially, re-experience coming up with projects and ideas uh, from their own heart, of their own creativity, intrinsically motivated, and together figuring out ways to problem solve so that these visions come to fruition. Because this is something that the modern academy um, may hold spaces for here and there, but is largely oriented against. Sociocracy in our classroom. So this is the closing slide. As a student from this classroom, I, Juan Pablo, still carry sociocracy. I imagine that this was a resonance shared among my peers, an opening of the possible. That was, in my mind, one of the main objectives of this classroom, an opening of possibility, because possibility is what is so often boundaried, the imagination. And it's from there that those realities of, for example, it's easier to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism come about. These these contexts that encourage us, or that sort of mold the boundaries of what is imaginable, what is feasible, what is possible, and what isn't. And so for students to be able to come to a classroom and directly experience something that's commonly understood as impossible, directly experience a classroom where you don't need a teacher who tells you what to do. You don't need a teacher who is sort of enforcing the same old top-down model, but you can instead learn together. You can instead learn essentially without the institution. You could learn and do these things outside of the university. What is the university for in that case? Sort of the opening of the possible as a conduit for these questionings, for these more radical explorations. So, yeah, the classroom is and was for us another starting point among the myriads, another fertile ground where hierarchy can be composted and the experiences of grassroots empowerment fruited. Experiences of grassroots empowerment can fruit. Thank you. I'll take questions now.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen. You can see each other. There you go. All right, John Buck. You're muted, John.
I raised my hand to plead guilty to being a brat. While you were talking, I put a whole bunch of stuff into the chat that I hope didn't distract too many people. But it was about there's like Sociocracy in Classroom has a nice documentation at a place called Rainbow Community School in North Carolina. It's got a lot of, I gave a couple of other citations where, kids, high school or less, are participating in and molding what they're learning in schools. It's more the case in India, particularly. If any of you heard Swarna Lakshmi this morning in her keynote speech, that was about that. But I particularly enjoyed hearing what you had to say today because I've not heard of anybody managing to get it into a university. So yay for that. And I really appreciated all the cool things you did with it. So it's not a question, but just a matter of appreciating what you had to say.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thanks for sharing. Gonna save these resources.
Others want to reflect on what you've heard, what came up for you? Anna?
Could you just remind me what the grant was for?
Absolutely. I don't think I elaborated actually. It was an environmental and social sustainability grant, and we applied. Um, Honestly, I don't remember what exactly we promised. That was sort of part of the spirit of it was we said we were going to save the world with like the couple pennies they gave us so that we could get the couple pennies, and then gave it over to the students so they could formulate what creative ways of doing activism they wanted to do.
And did you submit submit anything to the funding authority about your discoveries?
Yes, we did. We reported after the fact, and yeah, it was a very thorough report. I'm sure they enjoyed it.
Did you give them this presentation?
No, unfortunately not.
And just, I have to go. I'm sorry, and I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
I think there is a lot of opportunity, I mean, in the small scale at the universities, like the independent studies where people could do things. And I've had some connections with several of those over some years. And even just, the organization of a classroom, particularly if it's a larger classroom, and organizing it into small groups that have projects. So that it's not all, particularly the large ones that are 100 people in a room. How can we reorganize that to give more voice, more empowerment to the student? There was one thing that I sort of like, wait, I want to ask Juan Pablo what you meant by this, because we didn't need the classroom for individuals to do the seed bomb stuff. And I would say, I don't know if I agree with that. There's a both and. Individuals don't just act solo, and I don't want a whole bunch of worldwide individuals. I'd want individuals in context of groups that support individual action within the context of the group's consciousness. So just curious, just wanted to say that and see what that brought up for you.
Yeah, no, I'm in total agreement. I'm very critical of sort of the hyper individuality that tends to pervade not only the usual world, but even activist spaces. Um, I'm not sure exactly what I meant when I wrote the quote 2 years ago, but I think it was more critical of we don't need maybe the traditional class structure of the classroom in order to, like, you don't need to have come to a class in order to do activism. This is something that you don't, that doesn't have to be limited to this context. You can continue to do it beyond this semester.
And that actually brought up that other question of curiosity. If you've kept up with any of the folks that were in that class, I always think of like, what's the alumni network of this doing,
Yeah, no. One of the people from this group is one of my closest friends, and I met them in the group. And she and another girl, another woman attempted to continue the group during the next semester. I wish I could have invested my energies into that, but I went to study abroad in India. So the semester that followed, the group fizzled out, which in my mind is okay because that was the intention from the start. Yeah,
Marie?
agree.
Hi, thank you, Juan Pablo. I'm also a student, and so I was very interested in the themes coming up around like focus on institutions versus people, and as Jerry said, the dance between the two. And one thing that's come up right now a lot in my school, yeah, is like how can we use the infrastructure of the university to shape individuals and do things that maybe wouldn't be sanctioned by the university. And so I do kind of feel like it is a dance, and especially right now we're doing a lot of organizing at my school, the new school in New York City, around like sanctuary and protecting students from the administration's activities. And a lot of that has been very much like students organizing and doing learning outside of the classroom, to your earlier point. So I was just curious, like, did you find the class, like, given that it was a class in that structure, just to hear more about I guess any opportunities that you felt that afforded, or any limitations or practical limitations that had on the experiment or on the project? Like, was that ultimately supportive, or could it have been something that would it have been as effective of a project, I guess, if you had it be like an after school club, or like an extracurricular? Just curious to try to do similar things at my school. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, I suppose one of the benefits, and this isn't so much the classroom, but we had money because we applied for the grant. And so that was a very tangible resource for us. I would say that, I mean, I'm not experienced enough in organizing in clubs in um, sort of an extracurricular setting. But from my understanding and from my experience with the classroom, I think that might be a better, not better, but the fact that it's long term might provide more continuity for organizing efforts, because I think that organizing efforts do need that continuity. Something that I talked with professors about before is that the university kind of relies on the fact that students only stay for 4 years anyways. So there isn't, um, it's difficult to keep the same mission and energies going from year to year. And that's very much already a barricade on like organizing efforts. And so for us that we're only a semester long, um, we were limited to what can we do in 4 months with $2,000. Thank you though for the question.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Well, it makes sense that maybe the best use of that kind of a space then is to like shape the people to then maybe do
Right.
more, it's like the subjectivity building and the like experiencing it. And so I feel like that inoculation can go very far.
Yeah, that was our intention. I agree.
And I just
Yeah.
find it interesting that because you're undergrads, so in theory, you paid a ton of money to the university to allow you to teach yourselves.
Exactly. Oh my Lord. It's something that has always bothered me, is that I'm this isn't like black and white the case, but to a very large extent, so much of what I learned in university, I could have learned by myself. I did not need the institution for that. Um, I just need the piece of paper.
But what that did do though is that you had a kind of, in a sense, a little accountability system, that you thought you were in a class in a sense.
Right.
So you were held together and you knew that you had to complete, because you're still going to have to get your grade in a sense, whether it was pass fail or something, but you couldn't just not show up. It probably, so there was a bit of a container that the system provided. You could, and it would take work to create that outside of university system of container.
Yeah, and there was also the communities and
Yeah.
mentors. Yeah, Anne, sorry, your hand has been up for a while.
No. I was just wondering, after that experience, what, what future plans do you have? Like, did that give you impetus to do more things like that, or?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to talk about myself, so thanks for the answer for the question. Um, yes, I kept, like I said, I went to study abroad in India because I wanted to visit it was an intentional community for reforesting, and so I wanted to see how they did their sort of governance structure, and I had a lot of criticisms. It wasn't non-hierarchical. It was very hierarchical, but that was a learning experience. Um,
Cool.
I forget what I did the last 2 semesters, but I've since graduated, and so right now I'm working for a nonprofit in Willimantic, in Connecticut, and that's sort of in terms of looking forward, because I think that was the question. I want to leave the institutional structure entirely. I'd like to go back to South America and get in touch with what grassroots movements might be there, because in all honesty, especially with the way that things are going, not only here in the US, but globally, I confide more in the intentionality and energy of grassroots movements in the global South that have been doing it intentionally for decades and very much do it for survival and have pre-established community structures, in my view, that are sort of thicker and more well developed than what I would find like in suburban Connecticut. Like if the Iron Hand does come down here, I don't expect this community to be able to know, or in many cases, even be willing to provide mutual aid, for example. So
Right.
I want to move.
Interesting.
Thanks for the question.
Sure.
What else do we have?
So what country are you headed to in the South?
Well, I'm from Colombia.
Oh, okay.
My parents are. I was born in Boston, but I lived there for 7 years, so maybe there, but I plan to sort of do what Che Guevara did and rent a motorcycle or get a motorcycle in Argentina and go from the bottom to the top, and just explore. And because I think that's very, I want to fertilize possibilities by exploring as much, seeing as much as I can. And because if you limit yourself to one space, then possibility is narrowed. And I think the most important thing right now is the broadening of possibilities.
Excellent. Like the
Yeah.
Che.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I saw that movie. Just out with a, just you don't know how much I don't know if you connected with SOPRA, the Spanish speaking division of SOFA. But there's folks in Santiago, Chile, and Colombia, and Brazil, Peru, Argentina. So if you travel, you might want to check in on those folks, and they're all those people are involved in something interesting, often have to do with eco villages and permaculture. Like how do we rethink our relationship to the land? And
Yeah, I'd love to follow up on that. I haven't connected much with the
mhm.
Spanish speaking members of SOFA participants.
Hello, Nico.
Hi. Yeah. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk. I actually went to a continuation school with this exact model when I was like a teenager in Los Angeles. And so my teacher at the time was like very radical. It was student directed, like consensus based, like circles. We got to direct our own curriculum. I remember all of us like voting on what we wanted to learn for the day, and we pulled like experts from like all sorts of fields like in high school. And my teacher at the time found like loopholes within the administration to give us English credit, history credit, whatever it may be for just simply learning whatever we want. Um, and so within that system in LA, the school, LAUSD, the administration actually shut us down because we were too destandardized. Like we'd sued the school. It was like a big back and forth. They were like violating our rights with like metal detector searches. They were sending police in. It got pretty hectic, and we can connect up more on that later. I love to talk about this. It seems like you had a very similar model. And so now, me and my high school teacher at the time have started our own 501c3 to incorporate a very similar model of learner directed education and activity. And I have so many questions, but I have one brief one is when you talk about this to like folks within like an educational institution or even doing outreach, how do you describe the model? Because usually I'm doing outreach, I'm handing out a flyer, I'm saying, you can learn whatever you want. Like this is it's up to you. We have these resources. Here's what consensus is, here's what like anti-capitalism is, here's what like decolonialization is. Like it's so much to package into one. I'm curious like your experience with like presenting this large chunk of information into like something more concise, or just speaking to folks about it.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'd love to connect. Um, well, I'm racking my brain a bit because it's been 2 years, and because the group hasn't been active, I haven't had to describe it to people in a while. Um, but one thing that I think, just broadly in terms of like this form of education, the way that I describe it, that I think has been most resonant for me is my own experience of, and I guess my experience was a bit different because I didn't go to like a kick-ass school like that. I was in a hierarchical school for up until, well, I guess all throughout. And so what I would describe is, yeah, like kindergarten through 12th grade, I was just in this setting where, I was scared of teachers and I was competing with my friends, and 70% of what I learned, I didn't give a shit about and I've forgotten. Like it was such a waste of time. And like that's genuine to me. Like I felt a lot of grief over the lost time, the loss of my childhood, over the fact that 8 hours a day, 15 years of my life, I was forced to go to these places, wake up at 5 a.m. And it's like, that's not what we're supposed to be doing. There was this one beautiful quote I heard, I forget who from, but just sort of describing this intuitive feeling of wrongness in the world of like, it's a beautiful day outside. I should not be inside sitting in front of a chalkboard while some person lectures at me. And it's true. One just intuitively knows that something's wrong. Um, yeah. And so I guess that's kind of an emphasis on the negative, and I don't always love to do that, but it is That's a resonant go-to for me.
The frame that I would simply use is kind of the banking method of education, or the experiential method. Banking means like just keep putting facts in, facts, more facts, more facts. But the experiential is kind of what Juan Pablo described as, that particular course in yours, Nico, is like, let's learn by doing. And, interestingly enough, sociocracy has its roots in a school where there was experiential learning. It was a Quaker school that Gerard Endenberg went to, where the students and the teachers like, what do we want to learn and how do we want to learn it? It's like, let's make the chairs that we're going to sit on. We have to figure out how to make chairs, etc. So, and there are, just to say there are cracks in the system of, there's Waldorf schools, there's Montessori schools, there's independent and democratic schools that are, to more or less extent, more experiential. And even in a college level, I've worked with a couple of associations of biological science professors and deans, where their focus is, we need to strengthen science. What's science? Science is not a compilation of facts. Science is how do we think about what's going on and experiment and try something and learn from what we do? So just there's more allies out there in a way, even though the system is fairly regimented. So. And
yeah, thank you both so much for that. That was incredibly helpful. I don't want to take up too much time, but definitely shoot one of y'all a message. Thank you.
We have a couple more minutes if anybody wants to share, and then I just invite everybody to go to the closing session that Ted will be leading in a few minutes. So, anybody else have anything more? Not, maybe it's time for you to get up and take a little walk around your desk, go to the bathroom, come back, and enjoy the last half hour. So, Juan Pablo, thank you very much, and all of you in here.
Thanks for having me, and yeah, thanks everyone for coming. I'm glad you liked it.
Thank you.
I will close the room, and that sends you back to the lobby, blah, blah, blah.